Okay, Apush, welcome to the video for topic 3.2, in which I will teach you about the French and Indian War. Now, as you go through this video, I just kind of want to focus you in on what's going to be important with this war. This war happened from 1754 to 1763. It is considered a turning point. And we'll discuss why, but it is a turning point where we go from colonial America, where you have British colonies under British rule. Following the French and Indian War, that turning point, we're going to start to see the colonies develop feelings of resentment that will lead to revolution. And so this is a pretty important turning point event to understand. We're not going to be looking at the war itself and how it was fought. We're looking more at causes and effects of this war. So let's take a look. Okay, before we get too into the war, I want to remind you of the economic system the colonies exist in. Right, the colonies exist within an economic system of mercantilism, where European countries view, especially I'm circling here in England, right, and Great Britain, well, where European countries such as Great Britain view these colonies as a source of raw materials and a source of wealth, that ultimately the goal of these colonies is to enrich the mother country. Okay, so this is, if we're looking at this map, you've seen it before. This is, a lot of the trade routes across the Atlantic. And what we're looking at here is the triangle trade and the flow of goods. And you notice that manufactured goods are coming to the colonies, raw materials to Europe, for example. So this is the economic system. Okay, we want to look at the year of about 1750. So the French and Indian War begins in 1754 in North America. And so if we're looking at this map in 1750, this is the lay of the land for North America as far as European colonies go at that point. So we are familiar with the British colonies here. We have this idea that France is around, right? France is in North America, and they are seeking mainly trading, like fur and trading. France is not at a great extent creating colonies with a lot of people, for example. And then we have New Spain, which began with a lot of conquistadors, but then later over time has become colonized society. And so you can see that in North America, we have three major European powers. Okay, so what's happening in 1750 globally is that these European powers are beginning to compete with one another. There's an intensifying rivalry occurring. And the French and Indian War is actually part of the 7 Years' War that you learned about in Western Civ. So the 7 Years' War is a world war where, it's most of it is fought in Europe, and it's it's fought between major European powers. Well, it spills over into North America, and so there is fighting between the French and the British, and many Native American groups allied themselves with the French, although there were some that allied themselves with the British as well. Spain wasn't as involved in the fighting in North America, but Spain was involved in the fighting in Europe. So when we look at the map at the end of the war and look at how it's changed, you're going to see that Spain does sit down at the table, even though all I talk about right here is the fighting between France and Britain. So if we're looking at the colonies, what's important to note right here, I'm going to circle my mouse around this space in what is called, we have the Ohio River Valley here. You can see that this territory is disputed, meaning that both France and England are claiming this territory. And so the fighting is going to begin over land disputes in the Ohio River Valley. Okay, so what we're looking at when we're looking for the French and Indian War, some big ideas. Okay, this is English-French rivalry. I already mentioned it erupts into a world war. It begins in the Ohio River Valley. I showed you that on the map. And what's at play behind the scenes, or one of the motivations for England or the British to go to war here, is that the British, they want part of the fur trade, because that's not something that the British had been really practicing. And the British are also looking for a second opening into North America. So you have the Atlantic seaboard, right? The British have an opening into North America here along the Atlantic coast. But what they're interested in is possibly being able to control the St. Lawrence River, or being able to control New Orleans and the Mississippi, and having access into North America by those river systems. Okay, so also going on is that this is the first war that 13 colonies are going to fight together. So England and the 13 colonies will fight this together to defend the empire. It's against the French, their Indian allies, and then the Spanish, although, like I said, there wasn't a lot of fighting against the Spanish in North America. And interesting fact, George Washington started this war. So let's talk about how George Washington started this war that eventually became a world war, which is fascinating, right? Because the French and Indian War is only in North America, but it's part of the larger conflict of the 7 Years' War. George Washington started this. So let me see. I'm going to skip this. We've already kind of talked about how there is that disputed territory. But what we're looking at is where this starts, right? So this is going to start around present day Pittsburgh. And so we're going to talk about a fort that the French hold called Fort Duquesne, and then a fort that George Washington ends up building because he felt like he needed it after he attacked this French fort called Fort Necessity. And so the fighting for this French and Indian War is going to be in the backcountry, at the time of North America. So not in the settled colonies and the cities. This is in the frontier. Okay, so here is a young and dapper George Washington, and some background on him. He's a man who he'd never been to Britain. He was born in the colonies, so he's one of those people that was a British subject but had only ever lived in the colonies. He's a well-to-do landowner. His mother was fairly uneducated, but she had made sure that he was well educated. But on the part of the British, they kind of view him as a backwoods, like colonial, uncivilized, all of that kind of stuff. So the background that's going on is that the British are concerned about French forts in the Virginia territory. And this is that disputed territory. So the British view that as part of the Virginia territory. The French think it's theirs. And so they send Washington, and he's a major in the Virginia militia. So as you notice this uniform here, this is not a British regimental uniform, but they send Washington into the region that we would call the Allegheny River Valley. Right? Remember, I said this is by Pittsburgh, so the Allegheny River is a river in western Pennsylvania. And Washington has about 300 men. And so as he goes out to this French fort, he ends up leading his 300 men against the French fort of Duquesne, Fort Duquesne, right here. So it looks like Duquesne's Fort Duquesne. And he kills over 100 French. And then has to retreat and pull back a little bit. And what he is afraid of is that there will be a retaliatory action from the French, because he has his 300 men, but the French have some forts out there, so it won't take very long for the French to respond to this attack at Fort Duquesne. So he builds a fort called Fort Necessity. And this fort ends up getting attacked by the French, as he believed. It falls, and the French take control of Fort Necessity. And this is the beginning battle that kind of sparked off the French and Indian War, and the 7 Years' War. So what's going on is that the global tensions are so tense between these European nations that this attack was the spark or the catalyst that led to the beginning of actual fighting. And so There's a primary source where a British politician wrote about Washington starting this war. It says the volley fired by a young Virginian in the backwoods of America set the world on fire. So the French and Indian War begins. As it's beginning, there's a meeting of important colonial leaders in the city of Albany, which is in New York, right? It's in the colony of New York, and who we see here is Benjamin Franklin. He's pictured with a graphic that he made. Now, Benjamin Franklin was a newspaper man, and he knew how to advertise or sell an idea to people. So he put together a proposal for this Congress in Albany called the the Albany Plan, as it says at the top. And he put this graphic of a snake together, and you can see it's all cut up into pieces. And he says, "Join or die." Right. So he's what he's trying to do is propose that the colonies unite under one single government or political rule so that they can be more coordinated and respond better defensively or offensively during this French and Indian War. So some interesting things about the Albany Congress. It's in 1754 as this war begins. The British called for it, right? So we can see it's convened by the British, was led by Benjamin Franklin, and only 7 of the 13 colonies showed up. So when we talk about this Albany Plan, it's not all of the colonies together, but this is important because it is the first time or the first attempt at colonial unity. Now, what Franklin was hoping with this was this would create a kind of confederation of colonies to help keep the Iroquois loyal. So the Iroquois Confederation had sided with the British in the French and Indian War, and there was some fear that they would leave or change sides over to the French if it appeared that the British were weak or the colonies were weak. And so Franklin says this will allow the colonies to be stronger and we can keep our allies, the Iroquois Confederation. They also say we can defend better. And this plan that he proposes was unanimously rejected. So we can see this here. Franklin sponsored the plan for colonial home rule. And what that means when we say home rule is the colonies would govern themselves, right? That's what he's proposing. The colonies will govern themselves. And it is unanimously rejected by the British and by the colonies. So the colonies reject it because they say they don't have enough independence, right? So Virginians want to have a Virginian government. New Yorkers want to have a New York government. They don't want to have a national government between the colonies in 1754. And the British or the London politicians reject this because they say it's providing too much independence to the colonies. Okay, what's important to note, the reason this is important is that in 1754, there was not enough colonial unity to unite, right? The colonies unanimously rejected this. Okay, fast forward about 20 years. By 1776, the colonies will be united enough to declare independence, right? So we're only 20 years from the Declaration of Independence, give or take. So there's going to be a lot that happens over the 20 years following this French and Indian War. But this picture here, this cartoon, this is very important. As soon as you see this, if you ever see this on a test question or something, you immediately are coming up with the Albany Plan, and the fact that it was rejected, what they were proposing, yada yada yada. So everything on this slide, you see the snake, and this should be immediately what you come up with. All right, so I don't really want to go over French and Indian War in Europe. Okay, so I want to remind you, right? This is what we're looking at in 1750, a disputed territory here. The British are going to win this war, right? So it's going to take until 1763. The British and the colonies are going to win this war. And as a result, France is going to completely leave North America. They're going to lose their North American colonies. But one of the major effects of this war is that the British and the colonials have increasing tensions. So let's take a look at what's going on during the fighting of this war. So when we look at methods of fighting, the colonials, they tended to emulate the Native Americans. So we see guerrilla tactics like hit and run tactics. Um, the British would march in formation and use bayonet charges, for example. As far as organization, the colonies are organized under militias with their own local captains. So the colonial militias are local groups that might have come from a county, a borough, a town, and they'd have a local captain that they would serve under. And then the British are, they're a large army with officers. And the British officers want to control the colonial militias, right? They want to have command over the colonial militias. In terms of discipline, um, the the colonists tended to not have as much military deference or observe as many protocols. So things like salutes and marching in formation, for example, uniforms, all of that. And then the British were more likely to engage in drills and tough discipline. In terms of finances, the colonies did not want to finance the war with taxes, right? So it was like a local effort, a volunteer. And then the British believed that the colonists should pay for their own defense. So there's a financial resentment brewing during this French and Indian War. So the British citizens and British government are going to start pushing for the colonists to pay for their own defense, and the colonists will say, "We shouldn't have to pay any more. We are part of Britain, so defense should be included as part of the deal." In terms of demeanor, right, the colonial culture is much more casual than the British, right? So when we look at this, what the British see of the colonists is a casual, non-professional, and what the colonists see of the British is like this overly done up prima donna type officers with servants and tea settings, right? Neither of these views are 100% correct on either side, but this is kind of the view that starts to develop. Okay, so um, just over the fighting of the war, these are the types of conflicts that come up. Um, so as the war ends, what we see is the French are going to lose all land in North America. The English are going to inherit vast new land holdings, which means it's going to be expensive. So the war, Great Britain accumulates huge war debts, and then they also look at this new land holding, and it's going to cost a lot of money to protect it, administer it, everything else. So Britain inherits huge costs at the end of this French and Indian War. One thing that colonists realize is that the British are not invincible, and so this lesson kind of stays in the back of people's minds over the next 20 years, and American, as the American colonists end up seeking independence, they don't view the British Army as a military they necessarily can't defeat, right? One of the other consequences is that England begins to see that they do have a responsibility to defend their empire in North America. Um, and so we're going to see King George and the Parliament, which is Britain's word for Congress, they're going to begin to tax the colonies to try to pay for this defense of the North American empire. So these, you can see that some of these are going to be short-term problems, and then a lot of this is going to contribute to longer-term changes for the colonies and Britain. Okay, so the French and Indian War ends with something called the Treaty of Paris. So 1763, this is going to become a joke for us. There are 4 or 5 treaties of Paris that we have to remember. So this is the first one. So you need to remember the date and know what war this ended, because the 1763 Treaty of Paris ends the French and Indian War. The 1783 Treaty of Paris ends the American Revolution, for example. So And then there's one that ends the Spanish-American War. So we just joke about Paris is a nice city to sign treaties in. So you do need to remember this year, 1763, Treaty of Paris. What happens is France loses her Canadian possessions. And in a global sense, France loses most of its empire in India and any claims to land east of the Mississippi River. Spain gets all of the French lands west of the Mississippi River, and Spain gains control of New Orleans. This is significant because remember, the British would love to have control of New Orleans. Okay, England got all of the French lands in Canada. They gained exclusive rights to the Caribbean slave trade and commercial dominance in India. So, in terms of global impact, we see England's empire kind of goes on a rise, especially in India. But in North America, this is going to have detrimental effects for England in terms of empire. So this is what the map looks like in 1763. So you can see no pink for the French claims in North America. Okay, so England, we have the colonies inside of this red line right here, right? So those are our original 13 colonies. And if you remember, France controlled the St. Lawrence River and the Great Lakes region, but now Britain does. Britain also gained Florida from Spain. It's going to change hands again. And then this is what I was talking about. The French lose all of their claims west of the Mississippi River, and Spain takes control. So France is the big loser. Behind this this sign here, there's some Russian claims here in Alaska. These really don't amount to too much, so they're there, but you won't really be questioned on them too much. So what we see left in terms of France is a little bit of territory in the Caribbean, and then the French still have some fishing rights in Canada. So this is a big change in North America. Okay, so if we're looking at effects of the war, for Britain, increases her colonial empire, and it greatly enlarges England's debt. This war was very expensive for England to fight. And there's a general disdain or contempt for colonials following the end of this war, and this is going to create bitter feelings on the part of Britain towards the colonists. This is going to be a two-way street. So at the end of this war, England politically feels like a major reorganization of the American empire is necessary, right? So they are now, this is the point where England says we cannot allow these colonies to continue to develop under salutary neglect. It is time for us to get more involved. As far as the effects of this war on the colonies, on the American colonials, okay, it unites them against a common enemy for the first time. And because of that, it creates a socializing experience for all colonials who participated. So it doesn't matter where they come from, someone from New York, someone from Virginia, someone from Georgia. If they fought in the French and Indian War, they can speak about it and have that experience in common. So created a socializing experience. So another event that's going to bring the colonies closer together to one another and farther away from Britain. And then, I told you two-way street, the colonials have some bitter feelings toward the British that are going to intensify over the next 2 decades as we study. So you can see this is a huge, huge turning point event in North American history. So when I say was 1763 a turning point, yes, right? You absolutely have to know this year and have some events that you tie to this year that are a turning point in British colonial relationships. So we'll take a look at this. What we see here, this is King George III. He is the king during the French and Indian War, also the king during the American Revolution. So he is going to begin pushing for the colonies to pay for the debt. And he is going to push against any kind of compromises with colonial government. So we will pick up on him a little bit more. And if we're looking at this map right here, following the French and Indian War, if you remember, this territory that used to be France, this territory, kind of has to be organized. So these are the boundaries we have in the colonies. So we have our 13 colonies, but then there's just kind of some lines drawn across. So this territory here is both Virginia and Massachusetts. It's going to be terribly confusing. This territory is both Virginia and Connecticut. And then Transylvania. We don't even have a state called Transylvania anymore. So this map is going to change quite a bit. But one thing that the colonists are interested in is they want to move west of this red line and begin settling in this new territory. And the reason that, especially in the southern colonies, the reason these colonists want to move is because the land is all taken up and privately owned in the colonies at this point. And so there are people who want to begin growing cash crops. They want to make money, and they need this land over here. Okay, so this is, so the colonists feel like they have just won a war to give them the permission to move into this land. It's now British land. But the Native Americans in that territory are not keen on a whole bunch of British settlers moving into their territory and setting up plantations. And so there is a rebellion that begins in 1763, and it is led by a chief named Pontiac. So it's Pontiac's rebellion. And what Pontiac did is he encouraged tribes, different Native American groups, to combine their efforts and to resist these new British settlers coming west. And so he, he's encouraging his people not to make peace, to resist violently, but he was murdered by those who oppose his political views. That doesn't change the effect of what happened because of Pontiac's rebellion. This rebellion demonstrated to the British government that they would have to protect the frontier if British citizens were moving into these territories. And so we're talking about this area right here specifically. So what the British decide to do is they issue a proclamation that prohibits any westward expansion past this red line. So let me change this slide. Let's see what we have here. I thought I had it like listed, right? So they passed something called the Proclamation of 1763. So the idea is British citizens were not allowed to move into this territory. This was going to be set aside for Native Americans for the time being. And the colonists just were not okay with that, right? They wanted that land. They felt like they needed that land. So they ignore this law and they continue to move westward and settle anyway. And what this means is the British have to put troop patrols along this border to try to stop the British government. They have to try to stop colonists from going westward. Okay, other things that I mentioned, right? I mentioned that England's in debt. So Britain passes a series of laws. They passed the law restricting colonists from moving westward. And they keep British troops in North America to stop the Indian tax from happening. And then one thing that kind of sticks in the craw of many of the colonists is that the British now are going to enforce the Navigation Acts. They want to stop the smuggling by the colonists, and so they put in place a series of unrestricted search warrants where British agents or troops can search any colonial ship to make sure that they are not smuggling. So this is going to be a major issue and underlying the American Revolution as well. Okay, so here's my Proclamation of 1763 slide that I thought was a little bit earlier. So this is just a painting of those settlers, right? Those colonists saying, we're going to go west anyway. So if we want to recap this whole French and Indian War, You didn't get any information on the actual war itself, but we do know it started as a result of rivalry between European nations. And it sparked in North America because of George Washington. Um, Britain did achieve a major expansion, but at terrible expense. So the French and Indian War was very expensive, and it led to Britain attempting to consolidate control over the colonies. Okay, this is going to come back later because the colonies don't want to be controlled. Okay, following this British victory, there were attempts to limit colonists' westward movement. So the Proclamation of 1763 is that law that said colonists could not go west of that red line. So this is a major signal that Britain is not going to practice salutary neglect anymore. And as we know from Pontiac's Rebellion, Native American groups are going to seek continued trading with European nations, and they're going to continue to resist encroachment on their lands. So Pontiac's Rebellion, also 1763, was a major rebellion. Now, the next topic we go into is it's called taxation without representation. So the next topic is going to be a series of laws and actions between the British and the colonists that ultimately lead to the Declaration of Independence. So that's where we're going from here.